Donald Trump storms out after Ibrahim Traoré confronts him in front of everyone. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. It began with an unexpected envelope. On a crisp morning in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk flipping through briefing papers when his assistant entered, holding a heavy envelope marked with the seal of the United Nations. Inside was a formal invitation to the Global Sovereignty and Economic Integrity Summit in Geneva, a gathering of presidents, CEOs, billionaires, and former heads of state. One name in particular stood out: Donald J. Trump, listed as a keynote speaker and special representative for transnational business innovation. Traoré narrowed his eyes. He had no personal quarrel with Trump, but he knew what the man represented: decades of arrogance, exploitation, and selective memory dressed as leadership. The summit promised dialogue, but Traoré suspected it would be a stage, and one carefully choreographed to make the West look generous and the global South look grateful. "You're not obligated to attend," his chief of staff said. "In fact, it may be safer if you don't." Traoré leaned back, thoughtful. "That's precisely why I must go." For him, the stage wasn't a trap, it was an opportunity. The world rarely looked at Africa when it spoke of justice. But if he spoke there, they would have to listen. This wouldn't be just about Burkina Faso. It would be about every silenced voice, every stolen resource, every buried truth. "Book the flight," he said, standing, "and make sure I sit close to Trump." As the days passed, international media picked up the news. Will Traoré clash with Trump? Headlines speculated. A firebrand meets a showman. Commentators on Western networks chuckled dismissively, calling Traoré the latest anti-globalist populist. But in Africa, the reaction was electric. From Nairobi to Dakar, young people shared videos of Traoré's past speeches, his military discipline, his refusal to be patronized by world powers. Many whispered that this could be the moment Africa finally stood tall in front of those who had long mocked it. Traoré remained silent publicly, but behind closed doors, he prepared, not with speeches, but with documents, truths, receipts. The day before departure, he met privately with elders and youth leaders in Ouagadougou. "You don't confront a man," one elder said. "You confront a legacy." Traoré nodded. He wasn't going to Geneva to trade insults. He was going to hold a mirror, to expose the hypocrisy that cloaked itself in diplomacy, and perhaps, just perhaps, to awaken the conscience of a world too comfortable in its hierarchy. That night, as he packed a simple black folder filled with colonial-era treaties, trade statistics, and photographs of looted mines, he whispered to himself, "This time, the stage will not be theirs alone." Geneva had never looked so theatrical. Luxury cars rolled up to the summit venue under a sky of camera drones and murmuring journalists. Delegates in tailored suits and diamond cuffs shook hands beneath banners proclaiming "One World, Shared Future." The irony was thick. Shared by whom? In the opulent Grand Hall, Ibrahim Traoré entered without entourage, dressed in his traditional military khaki, calm and unmoved by the spectacle. His presence was both dissonant and magnetic. While some attendees whispered or smirked, others, especially from the global South, stood quietly as he passed. They knew who he was, and they knew he didn't come to applaud. At the far end of the hall, seated beneath a towering LED display showing graphs of global progress, was Donald J. Trump. Tanned, red-tied, and flanked by former diplomats and hedge fund titans, he laughed loudly, dominating the space like a king at a banquet. When he saw Traoré entering, his smile froze for half a second, just long enough for cameras to catch the flicker. Traoré offered a nod. Trump nodded back with exaggerated bravado. Two worlds had entered the same room, and the temperature shifted. Moderators shuffled nervously. Organizers sensed what no one dared say. Something unscripted was about to happen. The opening speeches were predictable: calls for collaboration, nods to resilience, applause for corporate sponsors. When Trump's turn came, the room buzzed louder. He strode to the podium like a performer, peppering his speech with slogans, "No handouts, only smart deals. Africa has potential, if it behaves. I respect leaders like President Traoré, tough guy, but he'll learn." Laughter rippled through part of the room. Cameras cut to Traoré, who remained still, his gaze unbroken. He let Trump finish. And when the applause died down, the moderator hesitated before calling his name. "President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the floor is yours." He walked slowly to the podium. No slides. No slogans. Just a black folder in his hand and centuries behind his eyes. The room fell into a hush. "You speak of deals," he began, voice steady. "Let me speak of debt. Not financial, but historical. The kind your banks earned from our stolen soil. The kind your companies mined with our sweat. And the kind you hide behind policies you call fair." The silence deepened. Trump leaned forward, smirking. But Traoré wasn't looking at him. Not yet. "I did not come here for applause," he said. "I came for reckoning." President Traoré opened the black folder, carefully removing a worn photograph. He held it up. It showed a Burkinabe child, barefoot, standing beside an abandoned mine once operated by a European company. "This is what prosperity has looked like for us," he said. "Empty lands, empty hands, but full vaults overseas." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each word landed with the weight of generations. We were not partners in history. We were plundered. And every speech about partnership that ignores this truth is a performance. I do not perform. His gaze finally shifted, directly to Donald Trump. The former president crossed his arms, clearly irritated. Cameras zoomed in as he whispered something to his aide. Traoré continued. "You say Africa has potential, if it behaves. But it's your systems that misbehave. Your financial rules, your interest rates, your trade deals. All written in ink we never held." He pulled out another document, a trade agreement from 1987 that allowed foreign companies to extract resources with less than 1% in royalties returned. Is this fair? Is this smart business? Or is it theft, sterilized through law? Trump chuckled, but it was forced now. The audience wasn't laughing. It was listening. Then Traoré said something that caught everyone off guard. "President Trump, you've built empires on the idea of winning, of taking, of dominating. But tell me, what do you own that wasn't first extracted from someone else's silence?" The room froze. Even the moderators didn't move. "You left your office with slogans. I walk into every village of my nation and see graves with no names. Gold taken. Lives erased. And yet you call us unstable." He closed the folder. "If truth is uncomfortable, good. It should be. Because comfort has kept too many quiet for too long." Trump stood abruptly. The movement was sharp, almost involuntary. He muttered under his breath, words the microphones barely caught. "This is a joke," he snapped. "I'm not going to sit through this lecture from some military socialist in a failed state." Gasps rippled through the hall. Traoré didn't flinch. He simply stepped back from the podium. Trump turned and began walking toward the exit. Dozens of cameras captured it. Donald J. Trump storming out while the rest of the world watched. Some delegates clapped. Others sat in stunned silence. But in that moment, something irreversible had occurred. Power had shifted, and everyone felt it. As Trump's footsteps faded down the hallway, a tension broke in the room, not with chaos, but clarity. Ibrahim Traoré remained standing at the edge of the stage, his presence steady and rooted like the baobab trees of his homeland. Then, something unexpected happened. One by one, several delegates from African and South American nations rose and began clapping, not loudly, but with solemn intent. It wasn't applause for drama. It was recognition. Traoré bowed slightly, not as a victor, but as a man who had simply spoken what others had long been afraid to say out loud. Outside the hall, Trump's team scrambled to control the narrative. His spokesperson claimed he left due to schedule conflicts and poor moderation standards. But the footage of his walkout was already trending worldwide. On social media, the moment was instantly clipped, subtitled, translated, and reposted with hashtags like #TraorTruth and #TheExit. Western news outlets debated whether the exchange had been disrespectful or necessary. African news, however, declared it something else entirely, the turning point. In cities across the continent, people gathered in internet cafes and community centers to watch and re-watch the confrontation. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone speak truth to power, and not flinch. Back in Geneva, Traoré declined all interview requests. He met privately with a group of youth activists who had been excluded from the summit's main sessions. "We're not here to entertain the powerful," he told them. "We're here to remind them that their decisions shape our hunger, our heat, our hope." One young woman from Sierra Leone began to cry. "They've never let us speak like that," she said. Traoré handed her his folder. "Then use these. Make your own voice louder than mine." The room grew quiet again, not with fear, but resolve. That night, from his modest hotel room, Traoré watched footage of himself at the podium. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he opened a handwritten letter he had carried in his jacket, from a miner in Burkina Faso who lost 3 fingers working in an illegal gold shaft run by a foreign firm. "Tell them we remember," it said. "Tell them we still bleed." Traoré folded the letter slowly, placed it on the nightstand, and turned off the lights. He hadn't come to Geneva for applause or confrontation. He had come for history. And whether the world was ready or not, history had begun to turn. The morning after the summit, Geneva woke to headlines that painted 2 very different pictures. Western tabloids screamed, "Traoré disrespects global order," and "Trump walks out on chaos." Yet across Africa and parts of Latin America, the coverage was celebratory, even poetic. "The lion roared in Geneva," one man spoke for millions. Traoré's speech had sparked something larger than diplomacy. It ignited a confrontation between truth and narrative. But power does not shift without resistance. Within 24 hours, Traoré's government began receiving veiled threats. Trade deals were under review. International aid programs were paused for evaluation. His aides knew. The retaliation had begun. In Washington, pundits flooded cable news channels. "He embarrassed a former U.S. president," shouted one. "Burkina Faso will suffer for this," warned another. Trump himself went live on a major network, ranting, "I've built towers taller than his entire country's GDP. That guy should be thanking us, not insulting us." His followers cheered. But something had changed. Younger audiences didn't see Traoré's speech as disrespectful. They saw it as righteous. Independent journalists and scholars released breakdowns of the statistics he cited. Even Western economists began writing op-eds saying, "Maybe it's time we listened, not lectured." In Ouagadougou, the government tightened cyber defenses after intelligence flagged coordinated attempts to hack official systems. Meanwhile, pro-Western opposition groups inside the country launched a smear campaign, accusing Traoré of jeopardizing Burkina Faso's economy for personal glory. The president's inner circle urged caution. "This will only escalate," warned his chief of staff. But Traoré remained composed. "They attack now because they fear the example," he said. Not the speech. The awakening. He called for a national broadcast, not to defend himself, but to speak directly to the people. "We may face storms," he said, "but what we build now will no longer be built with borrowed bricks." Around the world, support grew in unexpected places. A group of students in South Korea painted a mural of Traoré under the words, "Truth is global." Activists in Brazil staged a street performance reenacting the Geneva speech. Musicians in Lagos released tracks sampling his voice. A movement was being born, not one controlled by institutions, but by ordinary people claiming their right to dignity and accountability. And in every corner of that rising tide, one question echoed louder than ever. If one man could shake the system just by telling the truth, what else was possible? A week after the summit, an encrypted file surfaced online from an anonymous whistleblower inside the summit's planning committee. It was an audio recording, grainy but clear. It captured a closed-door conversation the night before the event between high-level Western officials, including aides to Trump. In it, they discussed how to handle Traoré's defiance, and debated pulling his speaking slot entirely. One voice, allegedly Trump's, laughed, "Let the African kid have his moment. No one remembers these people after the cameras are off." The leak exploded. It wasn't just offensive. It was confirmation that the system Traoré confronted didn't see him, or Africa, as equals. The audio was verified by independent journalists within 48 hours. Hashtags turned into marches. In Nairobi, thousands gathered outside the U.S. Embassy demanding accountability. In Paris, Black and African diaspora communities staged silent sit-ins at corporate headquarters tied to post-colonial resource exploitation. The West scrambled to contain the damage. Trump denied the recording, calling it AI garbage, but public trust eroded fast. A group of former diplomats released a statement condemning the casual racism and disregard for sovereign dignity evident in the leak. The pressure mounted. The confrontation in Geneva had not ended, it had detonated. In Burkina Faso, Traoré addressed the nation again. This time, he wasn't calm, he was fierce. "We have always known what they think of us. But now the world knows too," he said. "We are not children at the world's table. We are builders of civilization. Our gold, our oil, our blood made empires rise. But no more shall they be built on our silence." The speech, broadcast live across the continent, was instantly dubbed the Speech of the Dustless Tomb. It honored generations of Africans buried under exploitation with no justice, no voice, until now. Despite the backlash, Burkina Faso's economy didn't collapse. On the contrary, new trade deals emerged from regional partners and countries in the global south. Senegal offered joint infrastructure initiatives. Vietnam and Bolivia proposed a minerals exchange program. Traoré had cracked the illusion that prosperity required the West's permission. And as momentum grew, so did the movement. Students, farmers, artists, economists, all sharing a vision not just of protest, but of construction. In universities, lectures now asked, "What does sovereignty look like in action?" And across Africa, one name began to symbolize that answer. Not as a messiah, but as a mirror, Ibrahim Traoré. The aftershocks of Geneva reached the very institutions that once seemed untouchable. At the World Bank, junior economists began questioning long-standing loan conditions that had kept African nations in generational debt. At the UN, several member states drafted a motion calling for a special inquiry into post-colonial resource extraction agreements. Though procedural hurdles delayed the process, the discussion itself marked a profound shift, one catalyzed not by violence or protest, but by words. Words spoken by a man who had once been dismissed as a radical. Traoré had cracked the wall, and now the cracks were spreading. In the U.S., Trump's image began to fracture even among his staunchest allies. Conservative pundits who once admired his bravado now privately questioned his Geneva meltdown. If he couldn't hold his own against a small nation leader, one radio host muttered, how's he supposed to face China? Late-night comedians made jokes, but the satire masked something deeper, discomfort. For decades, the West had framed Africa as the learner, not the lecturer. But that illusion was gone. A viral tweet put it bluntly, a man with no gold mines silenced a man with skyscrapers. And the world was still processing that truth. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's administration launched the Truth and Transfer Commission, an open-access platform for tracking colonial-era wealth still held abroad. Each recovered asset would be publicly documented. The first entry? A colonial bond issued by France in 1912, now held by a European bank, its interest never paid. "We don't seek revenge," Traoré said at the platform's launch. "We seek return." Youth organizations across Africa began using the tool to file their own cases, supported by a growing coalition of pro bono lawyers from across the continent and diaspora. The legal system was slow, but something more powerful had already taken root: awareness. And in Geneva, the very room where Trump had stormed out was renamed. Quietly, without press releases or ceremony, the summit organizers replaced the brass plate on the entrance with one that read, "Room of Reckoning." No explanation. No denial. Just acknowledgement. A Western diplomat visiting weeks later stood before the plaque and whispered, "He changed the air in this place." The world hadn't shifted in an earthquake. It had shifted in a breath. A moment of clarity spoken on a stage where it was never meant to happen. And though many tried to pretend nothing had changed, deep down, they all knew nothing would be the same again. With international eyes turned toward West Africa, not everyone celebrated the shift. In quiet backrooms of foreign embassies and elite boardrooms, strategies were drawn. Think tanks published white papers calling Traoré an emerging disruptor, arguing that his leadership threatened economic predictability in the region. Lobbyists moved swiftly, pushing for the withdrawal of development loans and pressuring Western-friendly African leaders to publicly distance themselves from him. Sanctions were floated, not directly, but in the form of revised cooperation agreements that demanded concessions. The machine that had long drained Africa's resources was adapting to protect itself. Traoré, however, refused to retreat. In a national address broadcast to over 15 countries via a newly formed regional media alliance, he declared, "Let them revise their contracts. We will revise our future." His cabinet, composed of economists, educators, and cultural leaders, not just politicians, launched a campaign to rebuild domestic industries and decouple Burkina Faso's reliance on foreign aid. In a village outside Ouagadougou, a textile factory reopened for the first time in 18 years. Children wrote essays titled, "What Can My Hands Build?" And in classrooms, history books were revised to include the Geneva Confrontation, not as a humiliation, but as a resurrection. But the pressure mounted. Food prices rose. Fuel shortages increased. Western companies abruptly pulled out of several infrastructure projects, leaving communities stranded. Critics within Burkina Faso began to stir, some out of fear, others out of ambition. A protest was organized in the capital, with signs reading, "Stability First." Foreign media pounced, calling it proof that the people were turning against Traoré. But when cameras pulled back, something became clear. The protest was sparse, oddly organized, and most voices had unfamiliar accents. Whispers spread that it had been staged, paid for and imported to fracture the narrative. The people weren't fooled. Still, in the quiet of the night, Traoré walked alone through the corridors of the presidential residence. He passed portraits of leaders who had tried to resist: Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, all silenced before their visions were complete. He paused by a window, staring into the darkness. "What if I fail them too?" he muttered. But in that same moment, a candle flickered in the courtyard, held by a young girl who had lost her father in a collapsed mine. She looked up at the window and smiled, unaware of who was watching. That simple act pierced the silence. Traoré stood straighter. He whispered back, "Then I'll carry the flame until you can." In the days following the staged protest, something remarkable happened. Across Burkina Faso, and in parts of Ghana, Mali, and Senegal, ordinary citizens began organizing assemblies of the future. These were spontaneous community gatherings held in open fields, market squares, and even under trees, where people discussed governance, trade, and education without the need for politicians. Farmers proposed localized grain storage systems. Teachers shared syllabi infused with African philosophy. Children performed skits reenacting the Geneva summit. This wasn't revolution by riot, it was revolution by reflection. The continent had begun speaking in its own voice, on its own terms. Ibrahim Traoré refused to dominate this movement. Instead, he sent only one message: lead yourselves. I will follow. It wasn't abdication, it was trust. And it spread. In Bamako, youth leaders began translating legal documents once hidden behind foreign paywalls. In Accra, digital engineers created an open-source economic simulator to help communities explore local self-sufficiency. Across Africa, the Geneva Confrontation was no longer just a moment, it was a reference point. Before Geneva, and after Geneva, became a new way of marking time. And in quiet homes, elders began telling their grandchildren, this time, we are not bowing. Meanwhile, Western institutions scrambled to regain control of the narrative. The IMF offered restabilization packages to countries that publicly distanced themselves from Traoré. Some took the offer, but others, newly awakened, refused. A coalition of African and Caribbean nations announced a summit of their own, independent from the UN, with a theme that echoed through headlines: we speak, we decide. Traoré was invited, but as an attendee, not a keynote. He accepted with humility. This is what we wanted, he told Awa Diarra. Not to be the voice, but to unlock the voices buried beneath centuries of noise. Then came the unexpected call. A group of Western elders, retired presidents, Nobel laureates, former dissidents, reached out privately to Traoré. They didn't offer money. They didn't ask for alignment. They simply said, we were wrong. They invited him to speak at a global youth gathering in South Africa, where future leaders from every continent would listen. The invitation didn't come from a committee, but from conscience. Traoré accepted. But he prepared not a speech, only a question, one that had haunted him for months. If we could build a world without fear, what would it look like? If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.